So with that, we'll go ahead and introduce our first session and our group of speakers. So I'd like to introduce you to Millie Marsh, Stacy Bennett, and Brad Chapman.
Morning, thank you very much.
And they will be presenting on the 7 habits of highly effective feedback. So Brad, if you'd like to go ahead and share the slides.
Be delighted to do that. Thank you very much.
Sure.
All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this presentation. And I'd like to introduce our new book today, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Feedback, complete with expert commentary and real-world examples. The co-authors today, of course, are myself, and I'm the Mac Systems engineer. And Stacy Bennett, product manager, and Millie Marsh, senior Mac desktop engineer. The overall agenda for the presentation today will go through using Feedback Assistant, and then our product manager will share her perspective on this topic, and then we have a real-world example of writing feedback and some tips and tricks on putting that together, and then we'll recap everything with the 7 habits of highly effective feedback. So first of all, let's if you haven't done this before, this will hopefully be helpful. If you have, this is, I think, will be a good refresher about using the Feedback Assistant. So first of all, who can submit feedback to Apple? There are basically 3 groups: registered Apple developers with paid accounts, the general public when they are enrolled in the Beta OS, and members of the Appleseed for IT program. Membership in Appleseed for IT has a couple of criteria. First of all, your organization, whether that be a school, a private or public company, or a government institution, must be enrolled in Apple Business Manager or Apple School Manager. And each person that wants to submit feedback must have a managed Apple ID issued through that organization. This is really helpful when you have multiple people submitting feedback for different issues, and they can all be collated under the team, which has more impact when Apple is examining the feedback. The Feedback Assistant is available in different places depending on the device. If you're on iOS or iPadOS, the device must be enrolled in the beta profile and the app will appear on the home screen. If you are reporting issues with watchOS or tvOS, the Apple Watch must be paired with that same phone that's enrolled in the beta, and the Apple TV must be signed in with the same managed Apple ID. If you're on a Mac, Feedback Assistant is actually already on the operating system and it's not hidden in any way. Just open Spotlight and enter Feedback Assistant. It's deeply buried in the System Library Core Services folder. And on the web, you can actually log in any browser on a Mac or a PC and go to feedbackassistant.apple.com. Now, one of the things you'll be asked to do a lot when you're submitting feedback, whether you're working through AppleCare or you're reporting an issue to Apple, is collecting a sysdiagnose, which is short for System Diagnostics. And the keyboard shortcut for that is Control, Shift, Command, Option, period. This will cause the screen to flash, and then your computer will churn for about 3 to 5 minutes, and then you'll end up with a file in a temp folder, that sysdiagnose file. It's several hundred megabytes large and contains a lot of detailed logs for reporting an issue. Now, Feedback Assistant on the web looks like this. You log in with your managed Apple ID and you can see a list of all of the issues that you've reported, all the feedback. They're all collated together in one list, and you can access your personal feedback or team's feedback from this list. So by team, I mean the organization that you belong to. When you're switching from one feedback to another, it will save the draft that you're working on. Do note, though, that the web version of Feedback Assistant does not do automatic log collection, which we'll get to in a second, and you'll need to wait for the upload to finish before moving on to your next task. So how does that differ for the Feedback Assistant on the Mac? It has a traditional 3-column layout that you've probably seen with like Apple Mail and other applications. And as you can see here, the content is organized into like a smart mailbox, and there's some filtering options available as well. The personal feedback for your individual managed Apple ID is that first section, and Teams feedback or team feedback for the whole organization is in the lower section. You can open feedback in separate windows, so you can work on multiple feedbacks at once if you need to. And the feedback assistant will automatically generate and collect logs in the background, including for devices that are signed into the same Apple ID. If you have to report an issue with the Mac and the watch, or the Mac and an iPhone, for instance. You might not want this, for instance, if you're reporting feedback from some other device and you don't need your diagnostic log from this computer, so you can hit the trash can and stop the collection. Once you submit the feedback with all the attachments, you'll get a confirmation notice, and the upload is continuing in the background asynchronously, so it finishes collecting all of the attachments, and then it will begin to upload those to Apple. And then once that's done, you can even close the Feedback Assistant app at this point. It continues uploading in the background, so it's kind of a nice feature. And with that, I'd like to hand things over to our product manager, Stacy Bennett.
Thanks, Brad. Hello, everyone. As we mentioned at the top of the presentation, my name is Stacy. I'm a product manager and am hoping to give you some perspective on the person who is reading your feedback when you send it in. And in order to do that, I want to open up with a story that will hopefully illustrate some of these principles that Billy will go through in the next part of our presentation. So the story I want to kind of start with, I once upon a time had a 6-month contract working at a very well-known cruise company. And my job there was to document processes and recommend improvements and efficiencies that they could take advantage of using either technology they had or technology that they would need to purchase. And the first thing I realized when I joined on my first day, when I walked in, is how much paper they had. I mean, it was literally, shoulder tall. Like some of the stacks of papers came up to my shoulders. It was incredible. And as I start to interview all of the clerks and managers who are, working on these processes, I realize that the biggest paper generator are performance reviews. I don't know if you guys know this or not, and I'll sprinkle a little fairy dust here. Everyone who works on a ship has to have a performance review done at the end of their contract. Now, some contracts can last up to a year, but there are also contracts that are as short as 2 months. And regardless of the length of your contract, at the end of it, you have to have a performance review that will help the company decide whether or not you're worth hiring again. And as I'm sure you guys can imagine, on ships, there's limited room. If you've ever taken a cruise, cabins are very small. The amount of space that they have for technology is even smaller than that. And so in order to process these performance reviews, they realize, not all ships may have the same level of technology, but they all had a printing press. Ships have a printing press on board to print the daily newsletter that comes, at your cabin to tell you the day's events, what's changed, etc. So they utilize this printing press to create a performance review template, which was great in the beginning. People would handwrite their performance review details on this template. They would send it into the office. Someone would process it, put it in the person's file. Everything's great. But as time kind of went on, people decided to start to get a little innovative. And the way that they decided to innovate was instead of coming up with an electronic template for this performance review, they continued to use the printing press, but they would type their responses in a single Word document and print that out and literally cut and paste their responses into the paper performance review, and use that to mail it back to the home office for processing. And so that, the person who processed this, he would receive those. And part of the processing is that you have to make multiple copies of it for signatures, to make sure everybody understands the scores that were given, et cetera. And it was this clerk's job to do all of that. So as I'm interviewing this clerk, to sort of ask him, as the subject matter expert on these processes and working with these performance reviews, what can we do to make your life better, right? How can I make your life easier? I'm coming in as, a fresh pair of eyes. I have certainly not been working through any of these things as long as you have. What are your suggestions? And the biggest and sort of prominent suggestion that he came up with was, he said, Stacy, if you could get the ships to use tape instead of glue, that would allow me to better feed the pieces of paper through the copy machine to make all the copies I need to make, and then send them on. Which obviously, as I'm sure you guys have realized in me telling this story, we could certainly do better than tape, right? Which is what I told this clerk. I said, I think we can do a little bit better for you than that. We can definitely make your life a lot easier by creating electronic versions of these documents, and scanning in all the paper and just, going digital, right? But I think, the reason why I really like this story, and this clerk had a lot of, expertise. He'd been working at the company for 20 plus years. I think when he retired, he had over 30 years under his belt, is that a lot of times you are doing a job so long that your focus becomes very narrow, and it becomes very hard for you to see the big picture on things. I know it's something that I constantly struggle with as a product manager as well. You are working with, whatever application or system for so long, you start to forget that not everyone is familiar as you are with any of these tools or applications, right? So the question that I have always been taught to ask as a product manager, and the question that I'm suggesting that you all sort of take into mind is, what problem are you trying to solve? And what I mean by that is the problem that is presented to you, and the problem that you're having isn't always the real problem that you need to solve in order to make things better, right? It's as kind of going back to the example of the clerk, it's the solution isn't always tape. And the problem that you're working on isn't necessarily like continuing to process all of this paper, right? And the person reading your feedback isn't always an engineer. A lot of times it'll be somebody like me, right? And the person who's then reading that feedback, all they have to go on is what you send them. And so what you want to try to do is, you don't want to solve the problem, you want to explain the problem and explain it as well as you can. I know this is a change in mindset, change in perspective for a lot of you, a lot of admins. You guys are the frontline defense on user issues. You guys are problem solvers, you're firefighters. You're used to coming up with solutions, right? And when you're writing up your feedback on the issues that you're encountering, solving the problem doesn't help somebody like me who's reading it. You want to give as much detail as possible about the problem you're having, And you want to also make sure not to be overly technical. Again, you can't always guarantee that the person reading your feedback is an engineer who has the same level of expertise in the systems that you do, right? It might be somebody like me who, while I'm definitely a technical product manager, I'm not a developer, I'm not an engineer by any stretch of the imagination. But I understand how systems work and want to do whatever I can to help people when they come to me with issues, right? And so you have to keep that in mind, because one of the luxuries that I have is a lot of the systems I work on are sometimes internal systems, and I have the internal employees who are my customers to ask those questions. Or in the story I just told, I had the luxury of being in the office and interviewing everyone, right? You're not going to have that opportunity. This is your shot. You don't want to throw your shot away, right? So you want to make sure that you give as much detail as you can, so that the person who's reading it has all that they need to help solve your problem. And the other thing that you want to take into consideration is that you want to come at your problem from different points of view, right? As I kind of illustrated in the story I just told, it's very easy to get tunnel vision. It's very easy to have narrow focus. And you want to make sure that when you're providing your feedback, that you get as many different points of view as possible, particularly if you aren't the only one that this problem is going to affect. If it's going to affect your end users, if it's going to keep your company from achieving their goals. Those are the kinds of things that I, as somebody who reads these types of feedback messages, etc., those are the things I need to know, because companies have finite resources. And I need to make the best decision for the company when I am prioritizing what things need to get fixed. And if I see that your issue has widespread, impact, right? Not just on your job, but on your company's performance, which could affect, your company's relationship with my company. That's definitely something that will potentially, bump your issue up in the queue, right? Because we want to see the big picture. We want to understand the big picture. And then finally, kind of going along with the explanation of your issue, remember that what might seem like a bug to you isn't necessarily a bug. It might be an actual feature of the system and is working as designed. But because we don't have your specific perspective on the issue, we may not understand that the way that it was designed isn't working for everyone, right? And so don't worry about how to classify the issue. Don't worry about, how to fix the issue. Describe your issue and describe it in the most detailed, best way you can, and make sure that the person reading it understands all of the ways that this issue is impacting your company. And with that, I will turn it over to Millie, who will go through some real-world examples of feedback to further illustrate these points.
Hello and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you that are watching this presentation. So let's do some feedback. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to walk through the two most difficult things that people get writer's block on when reporting issues in the feedback assistant. And since we have our slide up. If we could advance, I'm just going to say advance. And this is actual issue that we have encountered in Monterey. Since Monterey is not under NDA, I feel totally cool talking about this issue here on our presentation. We were trying to use the erase all contents and settings, and we get this message. So we went through and checked the documentation, performed our usual troubleshooting. It meets all the criteria for erase all contents and settings, so we don't put any configuration profiles in place to block users from doing this. And so we're gonna go through and file some feedback. These sections are the ones that we're going to cover here today, which is the title and the description. The other two drop downs, if you have issues or need help with those areas, you can talk to your Apple SE, or you can reach out to the MacAdmin community. So let's go to the sorting this out. So in the feedback, what you're going to do is the title should be brief. Think Twitter, think text message. You want to include the essential idea from the original dialogue or issue. As you can see here on the right, these are just examples. They're going to get very wordy, but we did this so that later you can refer back to them and have a very clear idea of what this looks like. In this case, we want to tell them, the people reading the feedback, that authorized user accounts to open Erase Assistant, we want them to have that be possible. As I said before, the drop-down menu options vary widely, and so we are not going to cover that here. And then the meat and potatoes of the description is we want to describe what doesn't work the way you thought it would, or what used to work but doesn't work anymore. As Stacy previously mentioned, a change in behavior isn't always indicative of a new direction for Apple. Next slide, please. Answering these questions will help write the description. We will have a template of all these questions and the materials afterwards, but we're going to go through them here. The first question is, how would the user interact with the reported item? Now remember, Apple is a consumer-first company, and the user is going to drive everything. Even if we're talking about enterprise users, in this case, we want to explain what this experience is like. In this case, the user is not able to use the feature that as described. Next, please. What does the user need? Okay, well, describe it. Describe it as if the device isn't managed, or if the device is managed, or that feature is managed. Describe how it's supposed to be used. And then what are the options that the user wants? Now, in this case, we're talking about in the context of your company. So if the user wants to use this because it's been described in an SOP or documentation, then describe it in that way. What order do they want it? Again, in this specific scenario, we're going to talk about an entertainment company that might have reporters in a hostile part of the world. And part of their SOP is to be able to wipe their device in the field. But if you've got this error popping up, they can't do that. Next slide, please. Help Apple understand the secondary effects of the feature that is not working as intended. What are the default settings? So if the default settings are something that has been set by Apple that, isn't being restricted by MDM, call that out in the feedback. What does the user need? Next. Why would the user need to change these options? Does the user not have the ability to make the changes? If the user needs help, what steps do we need to take to resolve it? Again, these are all going to differ based on your organization. And the purpose of going through this exercise is to spell out what your story is going to look like. And this is going to be different for every organization. Finally, without this feature, how would we help the user work around the issue? Do they have to call the help desk? Is the situation, is the workaround possible? You have to, all of this leads up to letting Apple know how this specific situation is causing problems or causing the user to not be able to do their work. Next slide, please. The enterprise and MDM context is useful and probably super vital. Always include it. In this case, we don't manage this restriction. However, something is preventing this from happening. So don't assume that Apple knows this. Let them know how, this is behaving. And if it's something that has to be managed, talk about how that needs to be managed. How much of this enhancement can be managed? Where will these management settings live? What options does Apple need to build out? Again, referring back to Stacy's statements about not trying to fix the problem, you have to wrap your head around telling Apple this is what we need for our environment. But for all we know, they may have to create new code to address this as enhancement versus fixing something that we perceive as broken. So we want to also talk about what the future and state of this enhancement looks like. Next, please. By this point, the closing statements have practically written themselves. How will this benefit the user, the support staff, the administrator, the organization, and finally Apple? It might be that what you've discovered or what is happening in your organization is something that may actually benefit the end user in the end. And finally, the impact. Now, this is like the main meat and potatoes of the statement. Now, you want to include time savings, the percentage of your fleet that's affected. If there's a deployment blocker, take as many screenshots, videos, or create mockups. All of this information is useful. For those of you who have filed feedback in the past, it may be that you might not get information right away that's official, and that's fine. One of the things that you could do once you're done with this list of questions is copy everything and put it into that description box. Make the template available to other members on your team if you're not able to answer these questions. Hopefully this will help you pivot your thinking on how to present these findings to Apple. With that, we'll talk about these 7 habits. Stacy, do you want to cover the first 3, and I'll do or Brad, you do the first one, and then Stacy the next 3, and I'll do the last 3.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stacy and Millie, for that. It's good to be able to tell those stories and then be able to do it in a way that's going to help Apple understand the real impact. So the 7 habits of highly effective feedback are: send it early and often, and by that I mean to report feedback as soon as an issue comes up or as soon as you have an idea for a new feature request or enhancement. And right now during the beta cycle, this is the best time to do it. Obviously, you can still do that throughout the year, but right now during the summer beta is the best time to report these kinds of issues. So if you're not enrolled in Appleseed now and beta testing, recommend you do so. Stacy?
Stacy's on
Sure,
mute,
Mike.
so
Stacy.
sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, I put myself on mute. Apologize. Definitely apologize on that. So you want to make sure that you are precise and concise, but as I was talking about earlier, you also want to make sure that you include as many details as you can, because again, you're not going to have the luxury of the back and forth conversation with whomever is reading your feedback. And you want to make sure that you have the solutions in place, as Millie was talking about, you know, however you best can illustrate what you're expecting to see at the end of things will definitely help somebody understand what you're looking for and what your problem is.
And, you know, remember the human. Remember that the people who are reading these feedbacks are just like us. If you are frustrated or you are getting pressure from your own management, take solace in the communities that we have. Talk to people to get those feelings that may be frustrating you out, and leave it out of your feedback. Assume positive intent. Make the feedback something that is something that you would feel great reading and that you would want to help someone figure out. Work together. And finally, be persistent. Stay on top of the feedback. You can always add more notes if there's an HR department or a security department and they have impact statements to make, or they have feedback that they want to provide, even if they're not a Mac user. You can get them a managed Apple ID and they can add that additional feedback in there, and it will all help in the end. And I think with that, I want to thank Penn State University for providing us this opportunity to share all of this with all of you. We hope you have a great rest of your day and week.
All right, well, let's go ahead. There isn't a whole lot of Q&A, but we'll go ahead and ask the first question. It comes from Bruce, and it says, I'm actually in all three groups. Is there any advantage to submitting through any particular one, except that programming stuff should go through the developer account, I would assume?
Well, I will say, based on the information that I have gathered from talking to various SEs and other people within Apple on a non-official basis, when I went to Apple Park, I got a golden ticket. Can you imagine? The Appleseed for IT gets special attention for enterprise customers. Developers are going to get developer pivoted or that sort of context. They're worried about making sure the app works and works inside the operating system. And as far as the public beta, we don't get access. The public doesn't get access until much later on. So if you have critical issues that are important to the enterprise, get those in early and often.
Excellent point. Thank you. And just a fun comment, because it was a boat was shown, was the Love Boat. Everybody's talking about the Love Boat. All right, well, if that does it for our QA, I just want to give a big shout out and thank you to Brad, Millie, and Stacy for their wonderful presentation on filing feedback. It's quite important, and we hope everybody will submit those feedback tickets to Apple.